So to start this part of the series off, I'm going to be cutting down some 1/4-inch maple veneer plywood. The tabletop that essentially sits on top of all of the drawers, which separates the drawers from the top shelves, the customer wanted it to be as thick as the window that this will be next to, the windowsill. So it's going to be 1.25 inches. So what I decided to do was basically make a really not a cheap version, but a quick version of a torsion box. It didn't have to be as structural as a torsion box because it's basically just a facade top. So that's how I decided to go about doing it. It's basically going to be a 1/4-inch sheet of ply on the top and the bottom. In between that will be 3/4-inch plywood, so that will get me my thickness, and the front of it's going to be skinned with maple, which will give it strength. I usually use poplar for paint grade materials like this, but the poplar is a little bit soft, even though it's a hardwood, so the maple, since it's going to be the most protruded part of the piece, I wanted it to be the strongest. So I basically just ripped these down to size. The plywood, you can see I have a 1/4-inch key stock, so this plywood is actually a true 1/4-inch. And then I have the maple I ripped into strips, which is the front, so that is 1.25 inches. And I basically just made sure I had my dado stack to cut a true 1/4-inch down and a 1/4-inch across. So this is going to create almost a T-like piece of molding that will slip inside of my torsion box. This will make more sense when you see it, but I basically wanted a solid joint in the front, and the problem with built-ins are, since they're moving out of my shop and this whole thing is a little over 13 foot wide, I have to make all these pieces in sections. There's the T part, and you can see how it's going to sit in between those two pieces of plywood, and then I'm going to have these strips of 3/4-inch ply on it as well. So that's basically how the structure of this is going to go. But I had to make this top in 2 sections so it could come apart, not only for transportation, but carrying it through someone's house. 13-foot long piece of anything is going to be hard to maneuver. So I had a bunch of scrap ply laying around. I always have small cut-off pieces whenever I'm doing these built-ins. I just cut them into, I think they were 3-inch or 4-inch wide strips. This is the removable style I have on the bottom of the cabinets, and then I marked the true length because I always make those styles longer, and you could see I just have the spacing of all of these pieces. And then obviously, since the cabinets on the top are going to match the cabinets on the bottom, I have wider pieces where the foot of those cabinets are going to set. So this is pretty simple stuff. Like I said, I didn't go through and make a full true torsion box because there was really no point. I basically just needed these pieces of plywood to give me the thickness I needed for the piece. So I'm just going to glue this 1/4-inch maple veneer on top, and basically I'm going to have a little bit of a shallow groove in the front, which that maple trim I made will set in. So the important part of this is the back of this top piece of ply sits right at the back of my plywood shims, and then I'm just going to put a bunch of brads in it. Where they meet, I have it connected, but the second half of this I'll keep it no glue on it, so when I put it in the space it will look seamless, but I could transport it. So you can see I'm putting glue next to this one piece, and you'll see later how they come apart. I'm making sure not to permanently glue at the seam, like I keep saying, so that I could transport this. So then I have my second piece. I could do the same thing. I'm lining up the back side, and then I started using a chalk line just so it's easier to put brads in. I put a ton of brads in this so I didn't have to use clamps. You can see how that separates, and it's going to be painted, so it's really easy to fill in brad holes. So then I'm going to flip this so I could put the bottom on there. I'm lining everything back up, top of the cabinet, and then I could do the exact same thing on this side. I can glue it and attach the top. So that's what that looks like with the one side, and like I said, same process. So the longer pieces, I believe I made this a true 8 foot on one side, and then the leftover was whatever that is from 13, about 5 I forget the total length of this, but it was about, I think it was a little over 13 feet. You can see I'm making sure I have the back side flush, so the front side will creates a groove by doing that, and then my maple tea molding will slide in. Like I said, I used a lot of brads in this, so I didn't have to weight it with clamps. Pretty simple stuff for this. And then on this side, same thing, only I'm not putting glue where the seam is, so that this whole thing can separate. And this will also be pretty strong. Like I said, my seams are lined up so that the foot of the shelves, which I'll be building next, will fit in place. And then you can just see, because that plywood's set back a little bit, how that maple trim will fit in place. And that turned out perfectly. I could hammer it in there. It's a nice tight fit, which is what I want. And then this can just set in the shop. At this point, I switch gears. You could see in the back corner there, if you watch the channel, I started working on the vanities, and I didn't really touch this built-in again for a couple months after I made this top. But the molding in front is also removable, so this will come apart in 4 pieces. The 8-foot piece of maple, I made it go over the seam just to add a little bit more strength, and the shorter end goes after that. It was exactly 19 inches deep, which is what the customer wanted, and exactly 1.25 inches thick. So I was pretty happy with how all of that turned out. And then you could see what it looks like just setting on top. So to finish up the drawers, I'm going to go through this pretty quick, because the way I made the fronts, there's a little bit of a gap on the top. A 1/4 inch piece of plywood cut into little blocks filled that really nicely, and then I just went through and edge banded all of the sides. This is pretty simple stuff. Edge banding is really boring. I usually don't film it. So I just added those little shims, edge banded all the sides of that plywood, and then I also edge banded the tops, so when you pull out the drawers, you don't see that plywood as well. This is a long process. I hate edge banding. It's kind of a necessary evil when working with plywood, but that's basically what it looks like when it's done. You see how long ago this is, because I was making those shadow boxes in the fall, and then I just went through, and I'm pretty liberal with putty because it sands so easily. I puttied all the nail holes, and then because this is plywood, there's a plywood edge there. I just put a thin bead of caulk around the whole inside edge of there. That will not only add a little bit of strength to the connection between these pieces, but it will hide all the plies, so when you paint it, you won't be able to see. So then fast forward a couple months, I started the top shelves, and once again, all the plywood I had ordered at this point 4 months ago, like I said, was all different sizes. So I went through and I made sure to make all my shelf sides out of the same thickness, and then all of my shelves out of the same thickness. If you don't do that, all your dados will be the wrong size. So these top shelves, I believe, if I remember correctly, they were about 14 inches deep, which was nice. I knew at that point I'd be able to lift them because they're not super wide. And this is this exact same process as the bottom shelves, only much easier because I don't have to worry about doors and I don't have to worry about drawers. But I just went through, and there's going to be 4 of these, just like the bottom. So I needed 8 sides. I just went through and ripped all of this plywood. I think, looking at this, I'm getting 3 sides per sheet. So I ripped all of this down into my sides, and then I also ripped the shelves at the same time. Sometimes I have to go back and cut those to depth because the shelves aren't as thick as the sides, because I account for the backer on those. But usually I rough cut rip those while I'm doing all of this. I could set up a stop on the radial arm saw, and I could cut all the top of these off. This was a 10-foot built-in, but there's a decorative element at the top to hide some ductwork in the space. So I believe these were only about, I think, 6 or 7 foot tall. I can't remember. And then once again, because like I keep saying, these are all different sizes, I went through and I made a couple test rabbet cuts, a couple test dado cuts to make sure they're perfect so that the shelves will fit into place. And then I just put a rabbet on the top of all of these. This sets perfectly on the base. There's no bottom base, so I don't have to worry about that. So you'll see I have my sacrificial fence on the table saw, and I could just cut that rabbet for the top, And then once that rabbet's cut, I can mark for all of my shelves and cut all of those dados. That's my preferred method for joining all of this stuff together. It looks like I'm using a ton of force to send that through, but it's really not bad. It's just this cantilevered so much off the table saw. So I had drawn this up in SketchUp to send to the customer. I will not have plans for this because I modified the SketchUp drawing so much, but it did help with the shelves. They wanted all the shelves to be exactly the same height. So I used the SketchUp drawings to get that done, and you could see I have the spacing mapped out so that they're all the same height, and then it's just a process of sending all of these through. I believe with the top included there was 4 shelves, so there's going to be 3 dado cuts. Just kind of checking to make sure that came out right. Now you're not supposed to use the miter gauge in conjunction with the fence, but when you're cutting dados you can, because there's not really a concern of binding between the fence and the miter gauge because you're not going all the way through the plywood, so it makes it a little bit of a safer cut. All I do is I'm lining this up with my marks. I have it cantilevered off the edge. You can see that's what the dado cut looks like. It's just a groove for those shelves to set in. It makes the glue up for this so much easier when you have all of these joints. It's longer to make, obviously, versus butt joints or pocket hole screws, but I prefer this method of construction for all of my cabinet carcasses. I just find it to be sturdier and, like I said, much easier when it comes time for glue up. For the middle dado, my fence wasn't long enough, so I was able to kind of clamp the fence where I needed it to and cut this middle piece. That's the one drawback to this style saw I have. Going to the right hand side, I only have about 26 inches, so I do pretty much constantly find myself running out of space on that saw. But this is my stack of pieces face to face. You can see all of those dados are lining up, which is a good sign. If they don't line up at this point, you're going to have problems. And then I could go through and do the same rabbet cuts on the front in order to attach the face frame. So you can see what it looks like on the bottom there. It's just basically a rabbet cut on the front side of all my pieces. It's about 1/4 inch deep. So now that I know that this works, I decided to do all these cuts before even putting these together, just to make my life easier. So the first I'm going to do is put a 1/2 inch rabbet on the back side for the backer. 1/2 inch is a little bit of overkill for shelves like this, but because I used it on the drawer boxes, it's just easier to buy it for the top. You could get away with 1/4 inch, especially for a built-in. All of this stuff is permanently attached to studs in the space, so I don't have to worry about it moving. And then you could see I'm sending through all of my pieces. At this point I break it into stacks of 4, because for half of them you're sending the bottom through first, and on the other half you're sending the top through first, so that you have the rabbet groove on the appropriate side. If you send them all through with the top first, they'll all be on the same back side and you won't have 4 opposing pieces. So it's just easier visually to break it into stacks of 4 at this point in the shop. It kind of helps with making mistakes. I'm just sending all that through. I used to have a jig that I've misplaced pieces to that hold this down so that you get a true rabbet, which is why I send a lot of the stuff through twice, just to kind of eliminate the fact that it flexes a little bit on the saw top. So then you can see I moved the fence over, and now I'm going to do the 1/4 inch rabbet in the front, and that is going to be for attaching the face frames. Same exact process. I keep these broken into sets of 4, because you're going to have to make that rabbet on opposing sides, and I just send all that through. These are very simple joints to cut, and now that I have this process down, it's pretty easy work. Once that's done, because these shelves are so wide, these cabinets are almost 4 foot wide, I set up a stop on the radial arm saw, but use the crosscut saw to cut all of the shelves. It looks like it's not hitting the stop, but it is. And then I could cut all of my shelf parts. And then I put the exact same rabbet on my shelves as well. So I didn't change the setup on the table saw, and I could put that rabbet on there. So then that will be on all of those. When I dry fit these, all of my grooves will be in the right spot. You can see I'm just going through the stack fairly quickly, and then that will all be done. So then to dry fit these together, I like to pre-drill through the front so that all of my screws are lined up in the dados. It's easier to do this than to guess on the back side, or even, I guess I could do a chalk line as well, but this is pretty easy. I can flip it over and countersink those spots. One of the things I like the most about built-ins is I've done ones where one side is exposed or whatnot, but for this one it's wall-to-wall, ceiling to floor, so you really only have to worry about the front. You could put hardware and screws or whatever you want on the sides, it'll never be seen. And then I dry fit these. I like to do it this way before doing a glue up, just to make sure everything fits. All the screws will be in place. I'll set them up on the cabinet, and then I'll cut the backers. But this video is getting pretty long, so that won't be until the next video. At this point, they're very easy to lift. They're not heavy at all. I could slide them all in place, and then I can obviously do all four. At this point, you could see without the backer how unsquare they are. That's one of the reasons I like to use backers. They square up the cabinets, and that will be in the next video.